Welcome to the first in our series of online lectures for modern Latin America. Today's subject is pre-Columbian America. In other words, what was North and South America like before Christopher Columbus and the rest of the Europeans showed up in 1492 and the years that followed? As always, please take note of some of the key ideas, the key terms that you might encounter over the course of this lecture. Also, please take note of any questions that you might have. Please raise those questions with me through email, through discussion in class, however it is that you need to help clarifying these ideas. But please, when taking notes on these lectures, it's not enough to simply write down what's up on the PowerPoint slides. Please make sure you understand these things by writing down what's on those slides, but then also writing down some of the things that I say, because that's going to help you to understand and to begin to analyze some of the concepts that we're going to be following over the course of this lecture. So anyway, that said, let's get to it. The history of Latin America has many things in common with the history of the United States. For one thing, Latin American nations are a cultural melting pot that combine elements from a number of different groups. To keep things simple, we're going to focus on the three largest groups. The first, of course, are the indigenous peoples. The ways indigenous peoples lived varied widely, from the deserts of northern Mexico to the rainforests of Brazil to the peaks of the Andes Mountains. Some, most typically tribes that lived in the northern deserts of Mexico, lived in small hunting and gathering bands that numbered in the 20s and 30s. Semi-sedentary groups like the Tupi of Brazil practiced some agriculture while supplementing their diets with hunting and gathering. Still others, for example the Aztecs of Mexico, the Mayas of Central America, or the Inca of Peru, practiced large-scale agriculture that was used to feed huge cities with populations in the hundreds of thousands. Some cities would have rivaled the largest cities in Europe at the time. These peoples had science and technology that rivaled and even exceeded that of medieval Europe. A big question that scholars have asked over the decades is how many indigenous peoples lived in the Americas before the arrival of Christopher Columbus. That number is impossible to pinpoint. However, that hasn't stopped scholars from trying. Basing their estimates on archaeological evidence and oral accounts, some scholars have argued that there were about 60 million people living in Latin America at the time of contact with Europeans. About 30 million lived in Mexico and Central America, while another 30 million lived in South America. A second cultural group that helped make up Latin America were the Europeans. Of course, the biggest group of Europeans to settle Latin America were the Spanish, who dominated the region from Mexico through Central America and most of South America. On the map to the right, those areas are shaded in green. This helps to explain why the dominant language of Latin America is Spanish. But Spain was not the only European nation to settle what is now Latin America. The second most influential group of Europeans were the Portuguese, who settled Brazil. Of course, there were others as well. The British colonized the island of Jamaica in the Caribbean, while the French settled they settled half of the island that includes Haiti and the Dominican Republic today. The French colony was Haiti. Moreover, there were Italians and Germans as well. Still, the greatest European influences came from Spain and Portugal. The third major cultural group that makes up Latin America today are the Africans. Like in the current United States, most Africans were brought to Latin America by Europeans as slaves. Still, this forced migration was not uniform across Latin America. Most African slaves were bought and sold in the Caribbean and in Brazil. In fact, Brazil alone imported 5 million African slaves, while all of Spanish America bought and sold only about 3 million. Of course, the three groups did not remain distinct for long. Racial mixing was common in Latin America, as it was in the current United States as well. For example, in Spanish America, the offspring of Spanish and indigenous parents was called a mestizo. The offspring of a Spanish and an African person was called a mulatto. And the child of indigenous and African parents was called a zombo. The result is that it is impossible to speak of a uniform Latin American culture. Instead, it is a culture that includes elements of many different groups. Moreover, that culture varies from nation to nation and from region to region. But before we can talk about cultural mixing, I would like to talk a little bit about the cultures that were in Latin America before Christopher Columbus made landfall in 1492. This map gives you a taste of the cultural diversity of pre-Columbian Latin America. The most heavily populated regions of Latin America would have been central Mexico, where the Aztecs were building their empire, and in Peru, where the Incas were building the most advanced and powerful, where the Incas were building the most advanced and powerful empire in Latin America, and certainly one of the most advanced and powerful empires anywhere in the world. The advanced nature of these societies can be seen in the description of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan by one of Hernando Cortez's men. As he said, "This great city is situated in this salt lake, and from the mainland to the denser parts of it, by whichever route one chooses to enter, the distance is 2 leagues. There are 4 avenues or entrances to the city, all of which are formed by artificial causeways, 2 spears' lengths in width. The city is as large as Seville or Cordova. Its streets, I speak of, the principal ones, are very wide and straight. Some of these, and all the inferior ones, are half land and half water, and are navigated by canoes. This city has many public squares in which are situated the markets, and other places for buying and selling. There is one square twice as large as that of the city of Salamanca, surrounded by porticos, where are daily assembled more than 60,000 souls, engaged in buying and selling, and where are found all kinds of merchandise that the world affords, embracing the necessities of life. As for instance, articles of food, as well as jewels of gold and silver, lead, brass, copper, tin, precious stones, bones, shells, snails, and feathers." Here is an artist's rendering of what the city might have looked like. Note the wide avenues that divided the city into 4 quadrants. In fact, the entire city was planned down to the last detail. The Aztecs were a brutal people. They built their empire through conquest. In addition to conquering new lands and new resources, the Aztecs went to war to gain prisoners. Thousands of these prisoners were sacrificed every year in elaborate rituals of the Aztec religion. The key was blood. The Aztecs believed that their gods feasted on human blood. Thus, in order to keep their society strong, they believed that they had to constantly feed their gods blood. Meanwhile, in South America, another great culture was developing on the peaks of the Andes Mountains. That culture was the Incas. The Incan Empire stretched about 3,000 miles along the Andes, though it was only about 400 miles wide. Like the Aztecs, the Incas were a technologically advanced culture that built earthquake-proof buildings and an extensive network of roads through some of the toughest terrain in the world. They also managed to conquer the mountains for agriculture. By using terrace farming, as shown to the right, and extensive irrigation networks, the Incas were able to feed their massive empire. Now let's turn to the Spanish. Of course, most of you probably remember that first contact between Europeans and the indigenous peoples of Latin America began in October of 1492, when Christopher Columbus made landfall somewhere in the Bahamas. But Columbus was only the beginning of the story. In 1519, Hernando Cortez landed a small force of Spanish warriors at Veracruz in Mexico. From there, he marched on the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Though he was initially driven from the city, he returned and by 1521 had completely defeated the Aztecs. Just over a decade later, another Spanish conquistador, Francisco Pizarro, learned of an even greater and richer and more powerful Indian empire to the south. With a force of just over 110 men, Pizarro defeated an Incan empire 10 times its size, captured the Incan king, and forced the Incas to surrender. But these facts simply raise new questions. First of all, why did the Spanish invade and seek to conquer America in the first place? While we today see their actions as cruel and inhumane, they saw things differently. Another question is how they were able to subdue and control not one, but 2 massive Indian empires. These are questions we will consider in the remainder of this lecture. First, to understand Spanish motives, we need to discuss something called the Reconquista. The Reconquista was the name given to the 700-year battle to free Spain from Muslim rule. Muslim forces conquered Spain in 718 CE. The Reconquista ended in 1492 when Spanish forces finally drove Muslims from the peninsula. So what do events in Spain have to do with things that were happening across the ocean in the Americas? What lessons might the Spanish have learned from a 700-year battle against a non-Christian enemy? How might this have affected their first contact with native peoples in the New World? For one thing, Spanish success against the Muslims meant that Spanish soldiers viewed the world in black and white terms. One was either a Christian or one was not. Non-Christians were to be converted or killed. There was little middle ground. This was evident in the Spanish Inquisition, which was established in 1480, just 12 years before Columbus made landfall in America. The Inquisition initially targeted Jews and Muslims living in Spain. Once Spain discovered a new world of non-Christian peoples, they took this as an opportunity to bring thousands of new souls to Christ. This attitude is reflected in Columbus's journal, which was written shortly after he made landfall in the Bahamas. There, he and his men encountered the Taino people, a hunter-gatherer group that lived on many of the islands of the Caribbean. In describing the Taino, please note the passage. Quote, "It appears to me that the people are ingenious, and that they would be good servants, and I am of opinion that they would be very readily made Christians, as they appear to have no religion. They very quickly learn such words are spoken to them. If it please our Lord, I intend at my return to carry home 6 of them to your highnesses, that they may learn our language." This line reveals both what Columbus thinks This line reveals both what Columbus thinks and what the Spanish thought in 1492. Columbus was convinced that the Taino, in addition to being great slaves, would also easily be converted to Christianity. A second motive driving the Spanish in the New World was a push for wealth and power. Once again, the model for Spain was the Reconquista. During the Reconquista, those who led the Christians to victory over the Muslims were rewarded with grants of land and labor. In other words, those knights who defeated the Muslims would be given large tracts of land as well as the labor of the peasants that lived on that land. In America, this practice continued. Those Spaniards who led the conquest of the native peoples of America were given large tracts of land as well as entire communities of Indians to work that land. This was known as the encomienda system. Encomienda means entrustment. In other words, powerful Spaniards, known as encomendero, were entrusted with lands and communities of native peoples in America. These communities were to provide labor for the Spanish by working on sugar plantations or deep below the earth, in the gold and the silver mines. Again, this is similar to how the Spanish rewarded military leaders in Spain during the Reconquista. In exchange, the native peoples were to be given Christianity and civilization. This is where the ideas of the Spanish mission and the encomienda came together. Typically, the priest and the encomendero worked side by side with the native peoples, one harvesting the Indian souls and the other their labor. Things rarely worked out so peacefully, however. Native peoples who tried to rebel against forced labor or against forced conversion to Christianity were brutally punished. This drawing depicts such a punishment as dozens of native peoples are hung over a roaring fire, while to the left a Spaniard is about to crush a child's head against a stone wall. So, we have now answered the question of why, but what about how? In other words, how were the Spaniards able to conquer and subdue the millions of native peoples who lived in the Americas? One thing that played a huge role in the European conquest of the Americas was disease. The first scholar to write extensively about the important role that disease played in Europe's conquest of America, was a man named Alfred Crosby. Crosby studied a number of early accounts of the Spanish conquest of the Americas, and he discovered that at key moments in the struggle for the control of America, the native peoples were ill, and that these illnesses seemed to aid the Europeans. Take this account from the Florentine Codex by the Spanish priest, Bernardino de Sanaguin. The account describes the days after Cortes and his men were driven from the Tenochtitlan in 1519. Shortly before the Spanish made their counterattack, an epidemic struck the Aztec city. But before the Spaniards had risen against us, first there came to be prevalent a great sickness, a plague. It was in Tepehutla that it originated, that there spread over the people a great destruction of men. Some it indeed covered with pustules. They were spread everywhere, on one's face, on one's head, on one's breast, etc. They were indeed perishing. Many indeed died of it. No longer could they walk. They only lay in their abodes, in their beds. No longer could they move. No longer could they bestir themselves. No longer could they raise themselves. No longer could they stretch themselves out face down. No longer could they stretch themselves out on their backs. And when they bestirred themselves, much they did cry out. There was much perishing. Crosby coined the phrase virgin soil epidemic to describe these diseases that were new to cultures or a people, Because the disease was new to that community, the members of the community had no natural immunity. Some estimate that virgin soil epidemics can kill up to 90% of a population.